Hello, this is Sarah Kite with UT Extension at McMinn County. Hope that everyone's having a great day. This is our Connection Corner series. We've been doing this all of July. Hope you've caught the other videos. If not, they're on our UT Extension McMinn Facebook page and YouTube page. And today's a special day. I'm joined by two special guests, plus our tried and true Dr. Katie Conrad from UT Extension. And today we're going to talk about a serious topic, yet somewhat complex, and its connections dealing with domestic violence. So this might be your situation. It might be a situation that you're aware of because of a family member or a friend. You might be a bystander and just don't know what to do about it. You've been trying to help, or just this is new to you. So today we're going to go into some questions of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and what do you do about it? How do you kind of navigate through that? Some tips, some strategies, some awareness pieces. So Katie, I'll let you take it away and we'll get started.
All right, thank you. Yes, I'm joined by two experts on the topic, and we selected these individuals because of the nature of the topic. It is really sensitive, and so that's of course why I want to start this conversation with a trigger warning. That we will be talking about some really sensitive issues. It could be, especially if any of those who are viewing have been through this or known someone, just be aware that the topics could be potentially triggering. But I reached out to our sister department, Child and Family Studies, the sister department to Family Consumer Sciences at UT's campus. We have Dr. H., professor, faculty member of Child and Family Studies, and her research focuses specifically on domestic violence. And then we also have with us Rachael Searcy from the Family Justice Center, which is in Knoxville. She is the Coordinated Community Response and Targeted Outreach Coordinator. I think I got it all, for the Family Justice Center. So Megan, she does more of the research side of domestic violence, but also, and then Rachael does kind of more the outreach. So we've got both our research and our practical support to talk about the issue. And so I would like to start talking about domestic violence because from what I have heard, there's an expectation that the rates of domestic violence have been intensified by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I'd like to start off with Dr. H, if you could tell us a little bit about, some of the things that you've been doing with domestic violence. What does it look like during COVID-19, and how are researchers expecting that it will be impacted by the pandemic?
These are great questions. Thank you very much for having me and for having Rachael. It's always great to have a dialogue amongst individuals who are working directly with people and researchers, those of us who sometimes are working with people but love to partner with our agencies doing the on-the-ground work that's so important. So I think that what we do know is that there's certain things going on right now that increase the likelihood of or risk of domestic violence within couples and families where maybe there hasn't been any domestic violence before. But then we also know that it's potentially making things worse or exacerbating situations where there's abusive relationships that are going on. So some of the risk factors for domestic violence are things like unemployment is a really big one. And so we also, given the pandemic and its impact on local economies, we'll see that there's an increase of unemployment, which contributes to individual stress levels and increases the likelihood that, they might utilize violence or forms of violence if their stress levels reach a particular point. So that's one particular piece of this. Something that's unique, of course, about COVID is that even if not unemployed, we're all at home with one another for the most part, unless you're an essential worker or someone who's not able to be doing their work from home, but more people are at home. So even while employed, there's the stress associated with being in an enclosed space of varying sizes with potentially the entire family. So for those reasons, we suspect that there will be an increase of domestic violence in terms of, new cases of violence where maybe there hasn't been a history before. We also know that, one of the main ways in which some people cope with domestic or cope in general is through engaging in substances, whether that's alcohol or drugs. And there is an association between a risk of substance use and domestic violence. And with people under more stress at home more regularly, we might see increases of substance use which are then associated with domestic violence. We also know that some people cope with domestic violence with using substances as well to kind of numb feelings of abuse or violence. And so we might also see kind of these increased risk of some other societal issues and ills, like of substance misuse and addiction that are going on. One thing, and I think Rachael could probably speak to this, we've heard from some community partners across the country that numbers of domestic violence calls in some ways are really down because there's just a lack of privacy that's going on when there's people at home with their abusers. And so that doesn't suggest at all that abuse isn't ongoing, but that there might be a huge spike once we're released kind of from sheltering in place. And so it's concerning. I think people that are researchers and those who work with women and children in particular are really concerned by the lack of calls or the reduced number of calls, because we know that there is still these increases. So when I say domestic violence quickly, and then I don't want to take too much time, but when I talk about domestic violence, oftentimes people think about physical abuse or physical violence, and that is a component of domestic violence, but there's many other forms that may exist with it, but are also sometimes separate. We can't, it's important to think of things around sexual violence, rape and sexual coercion within the context of intimate relationships, but also non-physical abuse tactics like isolation. And that's a really big one, like keeping someone isolated from friends and family and work. And we're all in many ways very isolated. So right now, abusers are able to isolate victims in a way that they don't maybe have the same power before, because if your work might be a place of refuge, your school could be a place of refuge, but now you're isolated, so you might not be able to see friends and family, especially if you have elderly family members and you're worried about spreading any virus to them particularly. It's a lot easier to monitor and surveil a victim if you're at home in the same space. So even reaching out to a friend quietly or privately might not be possible in this situation. We're also seeing abusive partners leverage COVID, making people stay home further, because saying if you go to the grocery store, if you go and get this, or you see this neighbor, that you could bring COVID into the home, which might further isolate them. So there's a lot of different ways in which this particular situation can be used as a tool of abuse. And we're seeing that in families that are currently in home with an abusive partner, but we're also seeing that with people who share custody with a former spouse who's abusive, who maybe, for example, is choosing not to wear a mask or not social distancing, or is going to bars in high-risk places. But you have to share custody of your children with this person. That might mean that you're then putting your child at risk, and you might not have a choice if the courts are mandating that you do have to share custody. So there's some really complex issues that are going on that are really scaring victims and survivors of domestic violence, as well as the children who are in their homes. We can speak more to that if you're interested, but I think Rachael might have some additional ideas or ways in which this current situation is magnifying or creating new tools of abuse that I think that people should be aware of.
Yes, thank you, Megan. I would definitely agree with everything, Megan, that you just covered. We started at the Justice Center, when the pandemic started, our numbers did drop pretty significantly. They did start to pick up, maybe towards the end of May, early June, they started to pick up, but we're still seeing fewer calls. I think law enforcement are still getting calls, but to the Justice Center through our helpline, it's still lower than normal. We are hearing from people who are reaching out, not just through the helpline, but they're texting us, they're reaching out through email because they are unable to talk with someone. And so our advocates are having to get creative in how they respond to them, and really trying to make sure that they're checking in with their clients about what is safe for them, how to communicate. So whether that be through text or through email or other forms of communication. Definitely our clients are having to manage the fear of the virus along with their safety concerns. I think that one thing I was hearing in the beginning is that abusers were using the pandemic, saying that police weren't going to respond, that they were only responding to certain things and not domestic violence calls, and that shelters were not available because they were concerned that it would spread in the shelter, but then also concerns about if you're needing to flee and you can't go to shelter, and you don't want to endanger your friends or family with possible exposures. So people were stuck. And like Megan said, isolation is used as a tool, and COVID, the pandemic, just made it a prime opportunity to really use that. So it's been difficult, I think, for a lot of people, but the Justice Center has remained open during the whole time. We're doing things a little differently. We're not taking walk-ins per se. We're trying to make appointments for clients to see our advocates. But if somebody does come to the Justice Center and needs to speak to someone at that time, then we do have people that are available. Some of our partners are working remotely, but all of them are still providing the needed services.
Wow, thank you for all that. That's, there's several things that struck me that I didn't even think about, how the pandemic is intensifying domestic violence. And first off, the notion that it's using as another way of coercion and a tool for controlling. Just you can't go anywhere because of the risk to get sick, and it's, and then also just hearing that the amount of calls and the reporting of domestic violence has gone down. That really resembles what we've talked about in a previous video about child abuse rates. Children aren't in school. A lot of those who would normally report abusive situations for children are not seeing children, and so those reports have gone down, but it doesn't necessarily mean the rates have gone down. So it makes sense that domestic violence is the same, in the same sense, perpetuating, COVID is perpetuating domestic violence rates. And then the other thing that really struck me is that idea, and I noticed on the Family Justice website, and we'll share a link to it, with that isolation, being at home constantly and not having, it worries me, and I'm really glad that you all are doing outreach in this area of helping victims or survivors find ways to safely and securely access help. And so I'm really glad that your advocates are able to text and, kind of maneuver ways around being able to reach out and check in and make sure that they're safe. So knowing all of this is going on, and I know that the issue of domestic violence is so complex and very misunderstood, I think, for those who have never been affected by it. Sometimes as an outsider, if we hear of somebody in that situation, we say, well, why doesn't she just leave? And that's something that I wanted to just hear a little bit more about how you would respond to that when somebody says, well, why doesn't she or he just leave that abusive situation? Why is she putting up with that? Can you explain a little bit about the complexities in leaving?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So I think that question's a really common one. And I think even for those of us who study this or advocate and work with people, we can talk very generally about these issues. But when it's somebody that we care about or we love who's in this situation, we often also return to kind of the question of why don't they just, leave, or why are they staying? I try to, when I'm teaching about this topic or in working with others, try to emphasize how this puts a lot of the onus on the individual who's being abused and takes away kind of the power and the agency of the person who's perpetrating the harm. And so it's kind of like a way of unintentionally victim blaming and putting the onus on them. And so how I talk about it is thinking about barriers to achieving safety. I think oftentimes we're focused on leaving as kind of like the end goal or the only option. And that may be some people's long-term goals, but for some people, their goal is they want the violence to stop. So they may not want to leave their relationship for any variety of reasons, but their goal is they want the violence to stop or the abuse to stop. So thinking about them as like barriers to achieving safety is kind of how I focus on it. And one of the hugest barriers is a financial barrier to leaving. And so I think that that's where we'll see COVID as a particular challenge, because we know that individuals who do not have the financial ability to or feel nervous that they couldn't support themselves without their partner's income, or maybe their partner's using some financial or economic abuse to keep them away from their income source. That's a barrier to leaving, but it's also one of the main reasons why people who do want to leave a relationship return to the abusive partner is because of financial insecurity. So if somebody experiences unemployment during this time period and isn't able to navigate the unemployment services, which are very complex for most people to do, they may feel like their only option is to return to an abusive partner, even if they've left. And so financial piece of like as a barrier to leaving is really big. But I think another one that's children are oftentimes a catalyst to trying to leave to achieve safety because of concerns of its impact on children or direct child abuse. But it's also one of the main reasons in which people choose to stay in an abusive relationship because of societal norms that really emphasize the importance of two-parent households as like the premium or the best. But also the child might have a positive relationship with the person. Or in this particular case, I hear from a lot of women, particularly those who are more highly educated and have more resources, that they just have a lot of concerns of leaving because that might mean that they have to then share custody with the partner. And that would mean that their children would be away from them with that person. Whereas right now, even if they're experiencing abuse, they might still be able to mitigate some of the impact on the child. But if they're sharing custody and they have to send their child to, for the weekend or for a week or for a month or whatever it might be, that risk to them is unbearable, especially right now if there's differences in approaching to following like the CDC guidelines, for example. So I would say that those are kind of two of the bigger barriers, and they're really exacerbated right now.
Mm-hmm. I would also just add that, we know that when someone is trying to leave, that's a very dangerous situation for them. And so a lot of people do feel like if they stay, then they know where the abuser is. They can kind of keep a pulse on the situation. Whereas if they leave, then that's going to escalate that abuser. And like Megan said, if they have the children, then they won't have them. They'll have to share them. And so it's almost like you're constantly having to look over your shoulder and you're in fear. So a lot of people, I think, do choose to stay because they do feel like they have a little bit more control, and they kind of know where their abuser is and how to live in that situation as safely as they can and keep their kids safe.
Just one other thing to add that we kind of touched on was just the issue of, so for some women seeking shelter seeking emergency, or long-term, care from a shelter or another agency, that might feel like that might be the best choice. But there are many women who don't, that's not what they think would be the best place for them. And so they may typically, stay with their mom or a friend or a family member as a way just to even de-escalate the situation that evening. Maybe if someone has a substance use issue when they're drunk, maybe they take the kids and would typically go to a friend's or family member's house, and so that they knew that they could kind of diffuse the situation. But those options just are not as available right now. And friends and family may, be particularly concerned about the safety of bringing in the person under the conditions, but the safety also specific to COVID-19. And as our cases in East Tennessee and across the state are really rising, that's going to continue to be an issue. But just also I've been providing informal advising of someone in an abusive situation where their parents are elderly and they just can't go and stay with their friends and family because of those concerns. And so they really are trapped in a way that they typically are not trapped, other than staying at a shelter, which again may not feel of comfort to everybody, but it certainly serves a very important purpose. And so this, the fear of both the partner and, this deadly, widely spreading virus is just, it gives people very few options. And that's simply the reality of it.
So let's go into kind of now what, it's tough, it's hard. We know that COVID might escalate some things. We know that anyone that is an abuser wants power and control. COVID could just be another piece to that puzzle to make you feel like you're stuck. But what's the hope in all this? Someone's listening and they're listening on their phone. They're trying to get a game plan going. I know that anyone could be listening anywhere in the country right now. In McMinn County, we have the Hope Center. In certain counties and certain cities, there are places to go. There are national numbers, so if someone were listening right now and they're ready to break free from this abuse cycle because they know it's a cycle and they want to know where their next step is, where to go for help, they need a good, healthy connection, someone they can trust in to kind of guide them through the next steps. What tips or strategies would you all suggest for that person?
I would like to just say that there definitely is hope, and that there are people available to help and help individuals and survivors that are going through this to plan out a strategy to leave and to safety plan with them if they decide that they can't leave and they need to stay there. There are still a lot of different things and techniques and skills that an advocate at the Family Justice Center or any of the domestic violence programs that you refer to could help these individuals talk through all of this. We, the Justice Center, we serve Knox County, but we do not turn anybody away. So if anybody felt like they needed help and they called the Family Justice Center, they can call our helpline. We will get them connected to an advocate. We have multiple agencies that are part of our partnership. So we have law enforcement and also nonprofit agencies. So depending on who they would feel comfortable talking with, we'll get them connected to an advocate, and that person will help walk them through all of their concerns, talk with them, and start to plan, help them to plan, talk to them about their options. If they are from out of county, then they will refer them. They will help them with those things, safety planning. Anybody that calls the Family Justice Center is going to talk about safety. But they'll also be able to refer them to some of the other providers and domestic violence programs throughout the state. So I would just really want to encourage people, tell them not to be afraid to reach out if they can do so safely. And talk with somebody. You can call, you can reach out. You do not have to give your name. You don't have to give any identifying information if you don't feel comfortable doing that. You can do this anonymously. If you do feel like you need to get to safety, we can help with transportation. If you feel like you need to come into the Justice Center, we can help with transportation to get people to us and then to a safe place. But I think that's just what I would want to make sure is that people know that shelters are available. The Justice Center is available, and there are many people that want to help and make sure that people know their options and can talk through what's going on individually in their situation.
Yeah, I think that I think that people understanding that there's a host of resources, it's not just resources specific to like when you're ready to leave. I think for people who don't want to leave or don't feel ready to leave, or never plan to leave, that doesn't mean that you still can't get a lot of resources to help navigate your situation. And Hope Center and Family Justice Center can provide those resources. A few other kind of tangible tips that I recommend to people is that if you're in this situation right now and you're more isolated from people, I think now is a good time to connect virtually as best you can, whether it's text through Zoom, Facebook Messenger, secret apps, whatever it might be, with a friend or family member. And find somebody who's willing to kind of continue like keeping a documentation trail for you. So Tennessee and many states are one-party consent states, meaning that you can audio record or video record incidents that you're experiencing of abuse. If you can do so safely from your phone or other apps, you can record these without the abuser's consent, and you can save those and maybe share them with a friend who can keep those kinds of documentation or data. Of course, I think people in abusive relationships have a sense of what the risk is, and so they know kind of how risky that situation is. But oftentimes in custody disputes, not having documentation can be really hard in proving history of domestic violence. And so I often recommend, if you're a friend who's listening, being willing to keep track of when this friend texted me on this date and told me what happened. Take screenshots of the text messages, save them in Word documents. These have been admissible in courts during custody disputes, as well as when a couple instances in which women have been murdered by partners. And so keeping a documented trail of what's happening, and if you can't keep it safely yourself, have someone keep it for you. And so if you have a friend who's experiencing abuse or a family member, make sure you're checking in on them. Make sure that you're assessing their privacy before don't be the one that brings up any abuse unless they do so and it's a safe and private environment. But don't let friends who are in abusive relationships kind of slip through the cracks because they're being isolated. Stay in touch about TV shows, what they're cooking, how they're feeling. Just kind of keep that communication line open. And I think that one of the tips that's been suggested for women or men, for anybody who's in an abusive relationship and is kind of stuck right now, that there are things that you can do to protect yourself within your home. So if a conflict is starting, make sure that you move to a space, for example, away from the kitchen where there's Knives and weapons, move away from. If there's any firearms in the home, try to move away from them if you otherwise can't remove those from the home for the time being. Try to find safer places. Typically, it's not normal or typical conflict, resolution techniques to, avoid or diffuse. But if you're in a situation in which someone is abusive or has been drinking heavily, for example, and has abusive tendencies or histories, do what you can to avoid the conflict, diffuse, try your best to placate the person, to not escalate it. And that puts a lot of onus on the victim. But in these situations, these are more kind of survival tactics for how you can diffuse the situation to the best of your ability. The final other thing I would like to add is that for many kids who are in homes in which there's abuse, school, as I mentioned, school and extracurricular activities are really the place of refuge. Most kids who have homes in which there's domestic violence do not ever disclose the abuse to teachers or coaches or other formal service providers, but they do use school and reading and sports and music as like the spaces that are safe. And right now, kids don't have as much access or any access to those. So if you are a parent in which your children are in a home in which there's domestic violence, try to carve out spaces within the home where they can figure out how to take part in their extracurriculars, whether it's art or music or games on the computer, more screen time, that is things around their activities that they love and care about, so that you can try to create a space for them to kind of decompartmentalize what's going on within the home, recognizing that they're stuck in a way that they're not used to being stuck. And those school extracurriculars, all of those things are incredibly important as protective factors for these youth. So try to carve out those spaces within your home because they are probably being more exposed to violence that's going on than they typically are during a normal situation.
This is excellent information about such a complex issue and sensitive issue at that. So thank you for sharing all that. We will also share some resources at the end and links to Family Justice Center and the local McMinn County, I think Sarah said it was the Hope Center. Yeah. And also the national hotline for domestic violence, as well as I have a couple fact sheets and some information. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, I noticed on the Family Justice Center were some tips similar to what Megan was talking about how you can stay safe if you're in isolation during COVID-19. And it's a really great resource and suggests ways to make sure that to keep you and your kids safe from harm. If that is, trying just to remain calm and de-escalate the situation, but also making sure that you're in a room free of weapons. And if there's going to be violence, kind of keep making sure to go into an area that's separate from your children, because sometimes that violence can be perpetrated on children if they're around, and so on and so forth. But I thought that was a really important tool of tips for domestic violence victims. But I thank you all so much for your time today. And Sarah, is there anything else that you'd like to add in closing?
Yeah, I appreciate you girls coming today and your time, your expertise. And, there always is hope. We need to be aware. We need to get our resources, get our safety plan, get our action plan, and, do things in a safe manner. But there always are some things that we can do. In our ACEs talk that we had a couple of weeks ago, through all the traumas of life, if we have that one nurturing, stable, safe relationship, that healthy connection, that can really help us through a lot of the curveballs that are coming our way. And that could be intensified right now because of COVID and other things that are happening in life. So find that one person that you can come to that, can be your person to help you have that healthy connection, because we were made for those connections. We need at least one person in our court. So reach out, be safe, be healthy. I appreciate your time. We'll have some resources listed at the end that you can go to. There's always something out there for you. We are happy to help you. And we hope that you have a great rest of your day. Share this video with those that they might really help them. And I really appreciate you girls and your time, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye.